name is Father Doug McDonald, the chaplain here at CBU, and I'm happy to welcome you here to the Pit Lounge. This is in honor of the coal miners, and the coal miners who really, in many ways, helped build up this industrial area. And I'm wearing my tartan blazer in honor of the occasion, since we have a Scotsman in the house. And we warmly welcome his wife, Barbara, Michelle Barber as well. So I'd like to invite up now a student who's on the Cape Breton University Chaplaincy Ministry team. Her name is Paige Cox, and she will read the biography of our special guest.
Strathclyde Business School, University of Strathclyde, and before that was at the University of Southampton. He has held visiting positions at universities in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Argentina. Most recently, University of Otago, University of Adelaide, and University of South Australia. He is currently a visiting professor in the Faculty of Business Administration at Memorial University of Newfoundland. His research is on entrepreneurship and regional development with specific research focus on entrepreneurial finance, specifically business angel investing, and on entrepreneurial ecosystems. His research has a strong policy and practitioner focus, and he is engaged with numerous external organizations and government, including Canada's National Angel Capital Association, HM Treasury, Scottish Government, European Commission, Euro Chambers, Intertrain Ireland, Growth Analysis, and OECD. He is a non-executive director and trustee of Bethany Christian Trust, a social enterprise that addresses the needs of the homeless and the other vulnerable people. He was also on the board of Celebrate Kilmarnock, a community-based group that is seeking to transform this once prosperous town. He was the joint winner of the ESRC 2015 Outstanding Impact in Business Award and the 2018 Academy of Management Entrepreneurship Division Entrepreneurship Practice Award, both with Richard Harrison, for his research on business angels. He was a member of UK's 2021 REF Business and Management Panel.
Thank you, Paige. And now to officially introduce our special guest tonight for the Father Greg Lecture, I'd like to invite up Emeritus Professor here at CBU and founding board member of the Newman Society, Dr. Harvey Johnson.
Good evening and welcome. Very nice to see you all. Last night after the baseball game was over, I tried to write something down about Colin. And I was struggling a bit, not because there wasn't much to say, but I decided I had to do something to spark my intuition, if there was any of that left. And so what I did was, I said to myself, imagine you're going to write a novel, And the novel is going to be about what it was like to work with Greg MacLeod. I don't have a title for this novel yet. I have one potential title, but I won't tell you what that is. But I do have an opening paragraph if you'd like to hear that. With apologies to Greg MacLeod. As someone who knew and loved Father Greg MacLeod, I can tell you that when I would see him coming across the campus toward me, I could feel the blood leaving my face and a slight sense of panic setting in. My mind would race. Oh no, I say to myself, what does he want now? You see, I had things to do, duties to perform. I was settled, responsible, comfortable. I even thought I was a good person. He was within a few feet of me now. My life was about to change. Worst of all of this had happened before, many times before. I was Prometheus. It was always the same complacency dissolving, sanctuary destroying message. He was about to remind me that more is possible. That's the end of my paragraph. Since Father Greg was such an exceptional person, it was only natural for those of us who knew him and admired him to want to keep his spirit alive. In part, that's what the Newman Society lectures were meant to do. The lectures are a way of commemorating Father Greg's life's work. But more is possible. Universities like this one are largely built around young people and their dreams. You could say that universities are fueled by dreams. Through his actions, Greg showed us that we can change things. This is surely a message of relevance to young people. After all, there isn't much point in having dreams unless you plan to make a few of them come true. So, as far as these lectures are concerned, I think we have a little advice to offer, and that is, more is possible. Second point I want to make is that Colin has been introduced to you as an economic geographer. And I think for many people here, the idea of economic geography is kind of familiar with them. In North America, people study economics or economic activity. They are if they're studying economic activity, we call them economists. And economists, for the most part, are concerned with the national economy. So they'll talk about things like gross national product, gross domestic product. They'll talk about national employment rate, national unemployment rate, rates of interest, inflation, all those sorts of things. Some of the economists, if they're very good at math, spend all their time building models. And those economists are not very much interested in empirical evidence. If you want to learn about economic geographers, really you should be looking at European universities, because that's where they are. Almost any mainstream university in Europe would have a geography department, and in there they'd have an economic geographer, or perhaps a whole group of economic geographers. Economic geographers tend to look at economic activity and compare it in one place versus another. So they are looking at activity over space. That's the expression they use. So Colin, for instance, would look at regional differences in entrepreneurial activity, that kind of thing. Colin is an economic geographer, as you just heard. He specializes in small firms, entrepreneurship, business angel investment, and most recently, entrepreneurial ecosystems. It's fair to say that Colin is one of the best economic geographers in New York, simply put. And this is a track record that's been established over a very long time. You might think the distance between Glasgow and Cape Breton is very great, but Colin's connections to Cape Breton go back a long way, about, is it 30 years? Or maybe even more than 30 years. And the first time he came here, one of the people he met was Father Greg MacLeod. So the topic he's going to talk about tonight is one he has direct connection to, and I hope you'll enjoy what is, I'm sure, going to be a fact-filled presentation packaged in a logic that will allow you and I to maintain and hold on to many of the bits of information that he's going to provide to us. Colin Mason.
Well, thank you very much for these introductions. I mean, just want to respond to Harvey. Sadly, economic geographers are being driven out of geography departments, and they're ending up like me in business schools. I think there's well over 100 people in business schools who actually began their academic careers in economic geography. But anyway, just a follow-on. Thank you so much for the invitation to come here and to talk. As Harvey indicated, my links to Cape Breton go back a long way. I think my first visit to Sydney was in 1989, if I remember rightly, and I've made several visits over the years since then. And on these visits, I had a great pleasure to meet with Father Greg, and every conversation with him was enormously intellectually stimulating. Very grateful to Harvey for hosting me, or suggesting and organising this visit for me and giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm very grateful for that. I don't really think I need to say anything more about myself other than my academic links to Canada go back a long, long way. Back in the 80s, the Canadian government had a scheme called the Faculty Enrichment Award, which was designed to encourage academics in other countries to develop courses about Canada, and they gave an airfare and a bit of subsistence for people who come to Canada and to collect teaching material and then go back and teach about Canada. So my early visits to Canada were based on that sort of funding, and I had some opportunities to do some subsequent teaching and then do research. So I don't know how many. So my first visit to Canada was 1984. I would have come at least every other year to Canada. So my links to Canada are very strong. So there we go. So Paige is going to move my slides. If you want the first slide for me. So let's start with the concept of depleted communities, and here I'm drawing very much on a really excellent paper that Harvey Johnson and Doug Leone put together and published in 2004. And essentially the concept is that the capitalist economic landscape has profound geographical inequalities. Some people like Thomas Friedman wrote a book in the 1990s called, I think it was the other called The Death of Distance, or something. It was A Flat World. Somebody else, Francis Cancroft, wrote a book about the death of distance, and the idea was in this emerging digital world, distance wouldn't have the same sort of effect as it does now. The reality is exactly the opposite. Richard Florida, an American scholar who's now at the University of Toronto, talked about a spiky world. Economic activity is concentrated in particular locations, major cities, Toronto, New York, London, and so on. And there are lots of flat places where there's very little economic activity. And basically the capitalist system invests in places and then over time withdraws from places to invest elsewhere, creating what Harvey and Doug have called depleted communities. Towns and cities that have lost much of their rationale as economic spaces as a result of this corporate disinvestment, resulting in job losses, in high unemployment, both visible and invisible, population decline as younger folk leave to seek job opportunities elsewhere. But the older generations are, in a sense, trapped in these depleted communities, both by the lack of demand for the homes and the declining value for their homes, and also their social links. Indeed, I think it might have been Donald Savoy from University of Moncton talked about visiting grandparents. Much of the outflow of travel from these depleted communities is by older generations visiting their children and grandchildren in other communities. Next slide, please. Just to give an example of what I've been talking about from my own country, in Kilmarnock. Johnny Walker, the famous whisky company, it was founded in Kilmarnock in 1820, grew the business from its Kilmarnock base. In the 60s and 70s, it got absorbed into larger corporate groups. It was acquired, and the acquirers were acquired. And then in 2012, the ultimate owner of Johnny Walker, Diageo, took the decision to close down the Kilmarnock bottling plant and shift production to another factory, leaving, and then the building was demolished, leaving a huge scar on the landscape, a huge 10-acre site that was empty and is still is being replaced now, but it's a huge scar on the community. So, one example of the process we've been talking about. The next slide, please. The problem is that although economic activity has withdrawn, depleted places continue to exist as social entities, with residents retaining strong social connections and social bonds and emotional attachment to these places. But redevelopment, economic redevelopment, is unlikely to occur through conventional economic processes such as entrepreneurship, youth business formation, entrepreneurial growth. There's a long list of evidence that government efforts to revitalise communities have largely been unsuccessful, with any success, any positive impact being short term. Typically what governments have done is provided financial incentives for multinational businesses to locate production units or back offices in depleted communities. So basically they're bribed to come to these communities. So they stick around for a little while and then move away, and the cycle of investment and disinvestment kind of continues again. Where new economic activity has occurred in depleted communities, it can very often be attributed to the activities of community entrepreneurs. Next slide, please. Like a lot of terminology, it's kind of, there are vaguenesses about it, or imprecision. So there are really two types of community entrepreneurs. There are those who have been called entrepreneurial enablers. So these are folk who support people to help start and grow their businesses. And then there's the community business entrepreneurs, individuals who engage in the entrepreneurial process, to quote Harvey, embracing the tools of business to identify and pursue opportunities for the benefit of their communities. And Father Greg was a community business entrepreneur. Now, when I was preparing this talk, I really didn't know how much background to give about Father Greg, because many of you will know more about than me, but anyway, I'm putting some material. So as we know, Father Greg was a Catholic priest, scholar, social activist, and community entrepreneur over more than 40 years until his passing away in 2017, aged 81. He developed a program of place-based businesses to try and regenerate Cape Breton, and he wrote these up in various publications. Next slide, please. And he had status as a national and international community economic development pioneer. See the next slide? Is it yes, okay. Yeah, so these are just a couple of the many books that Greg had written really about his philosophy of community economic development, describing many of the initiatives he undertook. Next slide. So, why am I here? This is the reason I think why I'm here. I wrote a book review essay of a couple of books written about Father Greg and published in an academic journal last year. If we want to move on to the next slide. These were the two books that came out in 2020, 2021 about Father Greg. Daniel Doucette wrote a book about Father Greg the man, and Harvey Johnson wrote a book about Father Greg the actions he has taken. And these books beautifully complement each other. And I took the opportunity of having known Greg and wanted to make my small contribution to promoting his activities, and I wrote a journal paper that got published, and I think it was that prompted Harvey to suggest I would be an appropriate speaker, so I'm very grateful. The next slide, please. But this actually is not the first publication I've written about Cape Breton. My very first visit in 1989 to Cape Breton, a very short visit, through Greg I was able to meet a lot of people involved in the community economic development game at the time. People involved in New Dawn, for example, actually drew upon that information to write a paper that was published in 1991 about community development corporations and local economic regeneration in Canada, the Cape Breton experience. So this was, that trip opened my eyes to this response to depleted opportunity. So what I'm going to say will draw on that as well. Okay, so the next slide, please. So I should say, I forgot to mention at the beginning, in case any of you are wondering, when is this guy going to stop talking? I think I've got 27 slides, so you can get a sense how far it goes. I'll be actually about to take the watch on to make sure I don't go beyond 8 o'clock. So let me talk first of all about the place. Again, you know more about this than me, but context is critical in economic geography. So we know that Cape Breton was a booming economy in the 19th century based on coal and steel. I think it was referred to as the Pittsburgh of Canada at the time. It was that significant. But then, of course, the economy went into protracted decline in the 1960s with the exhaustion of the coal mines, the rundown and closure of the steel mills, and there's an excellent book I came across in preparing for that paper on the closure of Cisco. I can't remember the author, but it was a really interesting read. The mines and the steelworks were taken into public ownership, but not surprisingly that didn't reverse or decline. Federal efforts to try and create replacement jobs and replacement economic activity were largely ineffective. Some government established, some crown corporations were established, notably the heavy water plant, but they didn't last very long, they were closed as well. So basically all the things that the government tried to do to create replacement jobs were ephemeral, they just didn't last very long. And the provincial government pursued growth pole policies, which was kind of in vogue in the 1960s and 70s, the idea of trying to encourage economic development in particular locations, and that growth would spill over to other areas. Well, what that meant was that places like Cape Breton just didn't see any public investment. It all went into Halifax. So it was a bad time for the region. So move on to the next slide. So we've got the place, now let's focus on the person, Father Greg himself. And here I'm drawing very much on Daniel's book. Daniel knew Greg obviously very well indeed. So Greg was born and grew up in Sydney Mines. He was of Scottish and Acadian heritage, very proud of both heritages. He attended Xavier Junior College in Sydney and then Francis Xavier University. He then went into the priesthood because, and I love this quote of Greg's in Daniel's book, because it was the most obvious route to improve the world and society. That's a wonderful motivation. And this view is very much shaped by, again, by the context. The activities of Father Jimmy Tompkins and Dr. Moses Cody, who drew on the Roman Catholic social thinking to establish the anti-condition movement in northeast Nova Scotia in the 1930s and 40s, creating adult education programs, credit unions, various cooperatives, and essentially trying to create local empowerment for the people in that region. And that was very influential for Greg. Greg was ordained into the priesthood in 1961. Next slide, please. His first job was as an assistant to a priest who was actually one of the pioneers of the cooperative movement in Antigonish. and this priest encouraged Greg to get out and help people. He was assigned to a post in Xavier College in Sydney, now of course CBU. In due course he became a permanent member of the faculty and eventually research chair in technology. But recognising his need to develop the expertise to give him the tools to change society, he went to Louvain in Belgium to do a PhD in philosophy. He did that between 1964 and 1969. And during that time he also spent some time visiting the University of Oxford, which influenced him to take an empirical approach, seeing the local economy as his equivalent to the scientist's library in which to perform his studies. Next slide, please. He made extensive travels both during and after his PhD, where he saw the church as a force for change, and again that was influential in shaping his ideas. In particular, the Mondragon cooperative cooperation in the Basque region of Spain was hugely influential on Greg's thinking. Again, founded by Catholic priests, and again, he could relate to them. What the Mondragon cooperative did was provide an alternative to conventional economic development approaches, which Cape Breton experience and Mondragon experience has been not particularly effective in revitalising these economies. Moreover, Greg was struck by the similarities between Mondragon and Cape Breton in terms of their geographical context of remoteness, distinctive cultural and linguistic tradition, economic decline as well. One of the key things that Greg pulled out from Mondragon was the importance of local ownership of activity and the retention of capital. I remember one thing that one anecdote that Greg told me from the founders of Mondragon, and they said, when money leaves an area, suitcases follow. In other words, if you let finance be sucked out and extracted from the region, jobs will follow and people will have to follow. And that phrase has stuck with me, and that thinking was very much underpinned Greg's activities. Next. Yeah, so this is another of Greg's books, a really great book, From Mondragon to America, so tracing how the ideas of Mondragon have been applied in various places in North America, including Cape Breton. Next slide, please. So Greg returned to his university position in Cape Breton in 1969, and when he got back, having had 3 or 4 years away, he was distressed by its economic decline since he left. He said everything was the same as before, only older and more run down. When he talked about really seeing Cape Breton looked like almost like a third world nation, it was that economically depressed. He considered the region to be at a tipping point. Unless something was done, it would go downhill, further downhill, rapidly. He also considered, rightly, that economic revitalisation was unlikely to occur through conventional approaches. But he saw opportunities in the region's idle and underutilised resources, in its social capital, in its knowledge and skills. So he was optimistic that the region could be turned around. But to exploit these underutilised resources, innovative approaches were required. So over the next 40 years, Greg used his base at the university to take what he called action research, experiments to bring about socio-economic change in Cape Breton. So Greg was the exact opposite of an ivory tower academic. And it is interesting, certainly particularly in the UK, the expectations on universities and university research has changed from just doing research for its own sake to doing research that has an impact. My bio mentioned the research evaluation framework. So, impact of research on society is now a key performance indicator of universities. Greg was doing this stuff 40 years before it's now become an accepted or a critical role for universities to do. So that makes me smile. So that was the man. Let's move on to talk about the actions. So here I'm drawing very much on Harvey's book, and there are so many actions I could list, but at the university level, he introduced innovative interdisciplinary courses on economic development. He introduced the first ever MBA on community economic development. He set up the Brador Institute and the Tompkins Institute. He set up a Centre for Community Economic Development. He established several community businesses, notably New Dawn and BCA, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail. He undertook various actions to preserve the Cape Breton community, culture, a publishing company, Cape Breton School of Crafts. He promoted the Micmac studies at CBU. He introduced Akkadian and Gaelic studies. Next slide. He engaged in various forms of community activism to achieve local control of externally managed organisations. So he pushed for degree awarding powers for what was then UCCB. He participated in a successful opposition to the relocation of the Coast Guard College, and he successfully campaigned for a new community college in Sydney. And he also was involved in place leading. He was a place leader. He was a lobbyist of government. He was a public speaker. He was a media commentator. He was basically spokesperson for the community. In general, he made things happen. He didn't ask for permission to do things. He went off and did them. You know, the kind of cliche, it's better to apologise than to ask for permission. Anyway, I didn't get that quite right. It's the idea. You do it and then you rather wait for permission. Next slide, please. One of his early actions was the Cape Breton Association of Cooperative Housing, using grants and volunteer labour to renovate a building in Sydney for housing, commercial space and a craft school, and then various follow-up projects on rehabilitating old buildings for housing. The key approach of Greg's was to create an asset base that provided security to borrow for the next project. So one of his key approaches was building assets, building financial assets, physical assets that then supported the next project. But he was frustrated by the limitations of the community business model. Despite being very much ingrained in the anti-Ganesh cooperative movement, he saw the cooperative model as being too ideological rather, and too inflexible. So he rejected that as an approach. He looked outside his own expertise. He drew on the expertise of others. Notably an American called Stuart Perry. The next slide, please. And this was a consistent theme of Greg's. He looked for experts that he could draw upon and bring them in and involve them in his activities. So Stuart Perry was a US expert on community economic development, and Greg brought him to Sydney for some years to help him in his early initiatives. Next slide. So he launched New Dawn in 1976, structured as a company limited by guarantee. And at that time, that was a very innovative corporate form that ensured that money could not be taken out of the business. So the economic benefits accrued to the community. This idea of the entrapment of capital. You've seen cooperatives indeed being acquired by external owners, for example. So that's one of the reasons why I rejected the cooperative model. So he needed a business model that protected the community ownership of the economic activity and ensured that the wealth was recycled within the business rather than paid off as dividends to shareholders. Now again, you'll know this better than me, but New Dawn's structure encompassed encompasses still a range of enterprises and projects to promote community economic development, affordable housing and apartments and townhouses for low-income tenants, housing and care for seniors. One of the early initiatives was dental clinics to address the deficiency of dentists in the area. So dental facilities were built, dentists were attracted from off the island, and bought and could buy the practices, and that money was then used for other projects to fill a social need. Renovating a disused department store that was detracting from a main street. But, as Greg emphasised, these projects that he led on had to make significant contributions to the community and be commercially viable. Both boxes had to be ticked for a project to go ahead. Greg then stepped back from New Dawn in 1981, recognising his talents were in starting businesses rather than in running them. So he went off and was involved in starting various other economic businesses. Next slide. One of these was BCA, Banking Community Assets Group, a venture capital company established in 1989 as a response to the challenges of depleted communities in attracting investment into businesses. MacLeod considered that venture capital in depleted communities required a different model to that in the spiky parts of the economic geography, the Torontos and so on. A venture capital model for depleted communities needed to capture and recycle local wealth. But he also was able to access federal government co-funding by kind of modifying his initial model for BCA. And so the investment strategy of BCA was to invest predominantly in established companies, often companies that were in need, that were economically viable but needed a turnaround. So he typically brought in missing management expertise to these businesses. And the most prominent examples were Scotia Ropes, which is just an incredible example, and Tompkins Place. Harvey quotes in his book an economic assessment of BCA done in 2013 that confirmed the positive economic impact that its investments had on the economy. So, next slide please. So, let me now begin to step back a little bit and just offer my own reflections on Greg, based on my own contact with him and also the two books. So, reflections of Father Greg as a community entrepreneur. His personal qualities were essential. He was a charismatic leader. He had an effervescent personality. He was warm and generous, attentive and engaging. The community, again to quote from Daniel's book, regarded him with warmth and affection. That drew people to him. People wanted to work with him. People were open to his approaches. They trusted him, which came partly from his role as a Catholic priest. That injected trust, social capital, to use the jargon. Indeed, he used his social capital to mobilise the latent talent in the community. He appealed to people's better selves rather than their own economic interest to get involved in his projects, volunteer labour, for example, or on boards. He had multiple motivations for the actions that he took. Selflessness. He was not in it for personal gain, but to reverse Cape Breton's downward economic spiral. He was also motivated by the philosophies of Christian social teaching. Again, another quote. He explained he became a priest largely with the idea that this would be a means of improving society, and this is how I understand the gospel. Fundamental to Greg's motivation. And also the tradition of the parish priest, involving looking after much more than just the spiritual needs of the parishioners. But he recognised the art of the possible, and again another lovely quote, "I cannot change the world, but I can change my own backyard." So he was realistic in terms of his ambitions, which were bold. The next slide, please. He was also a pragmatist. He was very much anti-ideology. Despite the influence of the anti-British movement, he was not attached to the cooperative model. And indeed, he pioneered this innovative model of the company limited by guarantee. That did attract criticism, that his approach was not part of the Cape Breton grassroots self-help cooperativist tradition. Mondragon, as I say, was a key influence, because these founders also combined social Christian action with a business approach, based on business know-how and technical competence. And the next slide, please. His methods: he used the tools of business to pursue activities tailored to local needs that both created local jobs and created social value. So these businesses were filling social gaps like the dentist clinics example. So, because they were businesses, they were subject to market discipline and potential failure. So Greg sought to minimize the risks, or manage the risks, by drawing on the skills in the community, drawing on successful community-minded people with expertise to provide the knowledge and expertise needed for these ventures, often on a pro bono basis. He also recognised how critical boards were, but he also recognised the goodwill of the board members who served on the boards without any remuneration. So he also blended these volunteer boards with professional management who had domain knowledge. And his approach, again as I said before, was to build financial assets, typically property-based, which created the finance for subsequent projects. Next slide, please. Each initiative was intended to be financially self-sustaining. He used government funding where he could, but he never depended on government. If any project required government funding to be successful, that was a cross in the box. That wouldn't work. Business decisions were based on the needs of the community, not on eligibility for government funding. He recognised and said from his long experience that politicians were unreliable. You couldn't trust them. There was an example, I think, that Harvey quoted. There was a by-election happening somewhere in Cape Breton, and he recognised that that was a point where politicians would be willing to provide government support to buy votes, basically. So I can't remember the details, but he used that opportunity to get some government funding. Politicians were sensitive at that point to making promises to community. But he also recognised the importance of innovation. In his case, it wasn't technological innovation, it was innovation in legal structure, which was so critical, which underpinned the success of his community business. Next slide, I think it's my second last slide. So, as a community business entrepreneur, Father Greg achieved many positive outcomes. And these outcomes achieved much admiration. From the perspective of the university, as I said earlier, his role at the university was achieving impact, which, wow, that would tick so many boxes in the UK's REF evaluation. But his actions attracted criticism, not Greg himself, but some of the projects he did attracted criticism. In many cases unfairly. He criticised the things he never aspired his actions to achieve. But the approach to community economic development. I think one of the criticisms I certainly heard on previous visit was they were deemed not to be democratic. The organisation he set up, rightly or wrongly, but I remember somebody saying that to me. Inevitably there's a debate about just how significant the economic outcomes were. But Greg's activity was about more than just economic outcomes. He was also out to achieve social, cultural outcomes as well. They have to be factored into any overall evaluation of the impact that Greg made. And my last slide. What he clearly did was to demonstrate it was possible to imagine alternative approaches to the revitalisation of depleted communities. But this required an entrepreneurial mindset to turn these ideas into action. Indeed, as I reflected, his actions reflect ways of doing entrepreneurship that are only now being recognised and are now being kind of trendy. And let me pick out four. I've only got three here, but another one occurred to me. One was the effectuation approach. Now, in entrepreneurship, the classic idea is that if you want to start a business, you look outside for opportunities, needs that are not being met. And if you can find a need that's not being met or not being met effectively, you say, aha, there's an opportunity for me to create a business that meets, that fills that gap in the market. The effectuation approach is the exact opposite. It looks internally and says, what assets do I have that I can build a business around? So it might be a skill, it might be a spare room and you can start doing Airbnb, that sort of idea. And that effectuation approach can be applied to place-based entrepreneurship as well. I remember a classic example, Twillingale in eastern coast of Newfoundland. So when the cod moratorium hit and these fishing communities in Newfoundland where their economic livelihood was destroyed, the folk in Twillingate recognised they had a geographical advantage. They were located closest to Iceberg Alley, where all the icebergs kind of came down from the Arctic. So they reinvented themselves as a location for Arctic tourism. They had the boats, they had the fishing skills, and so they had the assets in place to reinvent themselves as a tourist location, and then they extended that to making iceberg beer and so on. A place in where I lived just outside Glasgow, in the early 2000s, it was a small town, 5,000 population, a main street of maybe about 15 shops. The majority of them had closed down. A community entrepreneur in the town managed to acquire all of these shops and turn them into craft studios and reinvented the town of West Kilbride as Scotland's craft town. And as it was off the beaten track, it actually pulled people into the community to visit the various craft studios, and then the remaining businesses also benefited as well. So Greg was doing place-based entrepreneurship using effectuation methods, which in his time were unknown. So he was ahead of his time. Another was collective entrepreneurship. And this is the idea, I mean, again, the tradition has been to see entrepreneurs as heroic individuals. I'm not recognising that any entrepreneur, their success relies on involvement of other people who have helped the entrepreneur on their entrepreneurial journey. So Greg didn't achieve all his accomplishments by himself. He was doing collective entrepreneurship involving other people who got relevant skills and know-how to support his project. So collective entrepreneurship is another relatively new, well, very new perspective on entrepreneurship these days. A third is place leadership. Place leadership, which again has only appeared in the academic literature within the last 10 years. Indeed, somebody said, the missing variable in understanding why some places grow and others languish is place leadership. Place leadership emphasising collaboration across private, public and community sectors. And the place leader has to have the capacity to influence others and engage across boundaries. Greg was a place leader before the concept was recognised and understood. And last of all, which I forgot to put on this slide, is the concept of community wealth building, which is a really very big initiative in the UK, particularly in Scotland. I think the idea was taken from the US and it was known under something else, I forget what, but anyway, the idea again is about retaining wealth within the community. So basically, community wealth building proposes that the major organisations in a local economy, which are typically public sector organisations, so the council, universities, schools, police department, whatever, they should allocate as much of their spending as possible locally in the community, rather than buying in bulk from elsewhere. Moreover, they should use that purchasing power to influence, so that the businesses they deal with locally practice good business practices like paying the living wage, their employment practices and so on. So they can influence, they can help to create good jobs or better jobs in the community and, as they support jobs in the community. That is now, many of the local authorities in Scotland are now practicing community wealth building. Greg was doing this throughout his era of practice. So, all in all, as I concluded my article, Father Greg's approach has got incredible value for the current generation of community economic development practitioners, and they should carefully read read Harvey's book, read Doug's book, read Daniel's book to appreciate how far ahead Greg was in terms of his thinking and approach to community economic development and the problems of depleted communities. Thank you very much.
So we're going to have a few questions now. Just before we open up the floor to you, you can just stand up and ask your question, and then Dr. Mason will answer. Dan also told me that that town in Newfoundland, they also made their own vodka, iceberg vodka. I was thinking about that internal effectuation method. I'm sure Cape Breton could figure that out too. Okay. Any questions? Just stand up and ask your question.
It's not the audience, it's effective, my audience.
I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk this evening. I'm a retired former steel worker, a 67-year-old individual. Lived here since 1967. I marched with great concern with 20 other thousand Cape Bretons back in that day. And we watched the change, and we watched our community basically be brought to its knees, and that's really changed much. Certainly not the political model. And trying to bridge the urban-rural divide and create entrepreneurs is the biggest task that I think we have in front of us. So to your points that you made there. City Steel, for instance, where I did work, did receive $250 million as the last major investment in Cape Breton Island from 1989 to 1992. 7 years later, the Premier then elected the province decided that it was better for scrap and to get that thing out of here and get rid of it. So that's gone. We're never going to get that back. Michael Enright on CBC was interviewing a gentleman who had written many books on the economy back in 2011, 3 years after the Canadian economy and the world economy had gone pretty much into decay. We asked him the question, so what would bring back our world's economy? Two things, he said. Farming and steel making. We're not going to have steel making back. But 85 years ago, this province, this island, was 100% food sufficient. Today, we only produce 8 to 12% of our food. The world is starving, and we have an issue here in Nova Scotia where we have 1 million acres of farmland. So we're looking at economic and rural development to bridge that urban and rural divide. We have over 1 million acres of farmland in Nova Scotia, 88,000 in Cape Breton alone. That's a template on which we should be returning to our roots to create a green economy, to move away from the carbon economy that we've done the sacrifice, paid that price for, and move towards a carbohydrate-driven economy based on the things that you pointed out. Pastor Greg was a mentor to me over the years, and I learned a lot from him. So those are the things I think we should be doing as an individual or as a community. And we have to look at bridging that urban-rural divide and using farming as a piece of the template and a piece of the puzzle to bring this province back and lead this island so we can be leaders and feed the world instead of where we're at. Thank you very much.
Yes, I attended a session back home a few weeks ago where various businesses involved in the farming industry were talking about the tech, farm tech, or ag tech, I think it's called, creates huge opportunities to the technology applying to agriculture to improve its efficiency. So you can promote, do exactly what you're providing, but also be promoting tech at the same time. Yeah.
That's correct, absolutely. Actually, to that point, if I may, supplemental. I've been promoting industrial hemp, just as a point, George Carafilis would be aware of that. I started in 2000 when they closed the steel mill, 99-2000. By 2010, CBU had done a study for me. Acadia has done 3 other studies actually for me since then. 3 weeks ago today, I was in Glasgow at Salt Springs, and they actually had just built a hemp decortication facility. 24 years since I started trying to use hemp as a piece of the puzzle, that ag piece and ag tech. The machinery's all there. They hadn't even plugged it in. The guy was actually wiring the facility while we were there. Again, that's just a piece of the puzzle. Hemp, 20,000 known uses 20 years ago. Today, almost 60,000 known uses. So that's just one piece in that ag puzzle and the ag tech piece that we need to bring the lines, and we can export that tech. It's all about technology export. We can do it here. We've got the brains. We have lost 60,000 people and 30,000 jobs since 1975. But to change that reversal with the new people coming in, where we don't have these mills up, we have to create more microeconomies that are going to create new jobs for entrepreneurs. So, thank you.
So I mentioned earlier in the evening that my research is around poverty, and it's kind of what I'm into right now. So throughout your talk, you contrasted Cape Breton's economy with Scotland's. So do you think, like, for example, like my final assignment, source of vigor. So like with the things that you're seeing in Scotland, is it comparable to the economy that you're seeing in Cape Breton, or like where is the?
Okay. Well, Scotland is about 5.3 million population. It's this. You can picture Scotland. You've got Edinburgh on the east coast, Glasgow on the west coast, the so-called central belt. So Glasgow and Edinburgh are very economically very successful. Particularly Edinburgh is kind of one of the leading on-road ecosystems in Europe. Within the central belt, we've got towns like Kilmarnock, where I live, that were prosperous 50, 100 years ago. Some of them were mining towns, some of them were steel towns, and they're struggling. And then once you get out of the central belt, you're into kind of rural economies. Some are thriving, others aren't. So we've really got a kind of lots of different kinds of economic challenges in Scotland. But maybe one of the things different is until you get into the Highlands, the geographical distances are quite close. So I say Kilmarnock, which throughout its history until 50 years ago was very prosperous. They managed to, as one industry declined, another industry grew. So carpets, railway engineering, and then Johnny Walker closed down. But it's close enough to Glasgow that you could actually commute to Glasgow for a job. So I mean, folks here don't have the option of commuting to Halifax or whatever. So that's one of the things where a lot of Scotland is commutable to where the jobs are. Of course, commuting is now not quite such a key part of the economy. That immediately struck me as one of the differences. But yeah, there's a lot of some of we've got, I say, declining ex-steelwork towns, lots of ex-mining towns, which have all the same sorts of problems as you have here. So as if the further you go into Ayrshire, where Kilmarnock is based, you see lots of ex-mining towns. Yeah. And of course, one of the problems there is that folk, the bright school kids go off to the University of Glasgow or Edinburgh, and they never return. And so, I mean, you've got that problem here as well. So you've lost the talent. Thanks for that.
So we have here in Cape Breton now, our economy is really bad, and we have a lot of housing insecurity, we have a lot of food insecurity, there's just so many insecurities. I'm wondering if that was something that we went through in Scotland as the economy got bad and people lost their jobs, especially like the cost of everything has gone so high, and if you had to deal with that, did you deal with it, and how did you deal with it?
No, it's exactly the same. I mean, one of the interesting things, I follow kind of CBC News and so on, and so I switch from reading the British news to the Canadian news, and it's deja vu. All the issues the huge problems that we have in the UK, that you describe, you read the same stories. Interesting, when we were in Toronto, my wife and I, we bumped into a couple. We kind of picked up the accent of a Scottish couple. The guy was a medical doctor who was working at the sick children's hospital in Toronto. So I said to him, how do you find the Canadian health system is better than the NHS in the UK? And he said, well, I was expecting it to be, but I found it wasn't any different. So I thought, the problems are common wherever you go. Oh, sorry. Oh, you. Not the instructions for me.
Yes, I'm Albert Room. You know, One of the political professors here at the university suggested that we get a group of up to 100 people that meet maybe on a monthly basis to discuss the problems we have in Cape Breton, or CBR. So we did. That was Dr. Sean, I forget his last name, just a note. We did set it up, and we had one meeting already, and we came up with a lot of good ideas about the housing shortage, about the homeless people, and so we're going to tackle problems one by one. And next month we're going to have another, in November we're going to have another meeting and tackle the problems of the taxes and the money and so on. We realize that our taxes are 2 or 3 times as high as they are in Halifax, both for home and industrial. So why would anybody set up a business down here? Because the taxes are so high. I wouldn't set up a business in Cape Breton. I could go to Dartmouth and have half the tax or 1/3 the tax and a lot more business. The federal government has said that you have an inequality in a lot of parts of Canada. So we're going to give billions of dollars to the provinces to distribute to the areas that are in need. And Nova Scotia did a study and said that 50% of this inequality is in CBRN. The amount of money that the federal government donated to the province of Nova Scotia to eliminate this inequality is now $2,800 million. And 51% of that is $1,450 million, which should come to CBRN this year and next year and whatever other years until we're equal in taxation of both the commercial and the residential people. And that ties in with this idea that you have of what Father Greg was doing with the entrepreneurship here and economic activity and so on. There has to be a start to get us up to an equal status so that we make the decisions about where the money is spent and not the unreliable politicians that Father Greg talked about. And we have found to be very unreliable because now we have a democracy that's from the top down rather than from the people up. They don't speak for us in their legislatures, and we have to have people that will do that. I appreciate the fact that there's some priests right here in this room, Father Burke and Father MacDonald and maybe others that I don't know about who are working to help people, but they're being hamstrung by the fact that we don't get the money that is supposed to be coming down here through the political process. So that's a very, very great danger. We need your prayers, we need your work, we need your votes to make sure that the politicians will be our politicians asking for what we need up this way and not having it all from above. It's not democracy. It's not democracy. So I appreciate your talk, Colin. It was really very, very inspiring. But Father, I graduated with Father Greg. I was ordained the same year, and I taught with him, and I appreciate his work, and I belonged to the BCA group and moved on, and all those things that he was involved in. And he did a lot of great work against great adversity. So, we're not stupid now here, but we're losing a lot of our young people that are smart and educated and going away. Separated from their grandparents, not a good thing. So those are the things that we have to fight for. And we have to fight for it with the resources that we have. Thank you.
Comment. Just at the beginning there, you used the term social capital. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more, and how we can retain what we have and that and exploit that and use it. Our social capital, whatever, I'm not quite sure in my mind what you mean by that.
Yes, it's one of these terms that you can define in different ways, but it's a kind of, it's who you know, what you know, your networks, your connections. I think that's the epitome of social networks. I mean, we know the connectivity is critical, and both, somebody developed a concept of strong links and weak links. So we all have a kind of relatively small number of people that we know very well, which calls the strong links. And they're people typically very much like ourselves. So we don't learn an awful lot from them because we're like them, they're like us. The weak links are a wider set of weaker links and contacts and so on. And they're going to be more diversified sets of people. And that's the people we can learn from because they're less like us. So that would be an example of social capital. How big is our weak link? But it's all about kind of connectivity. Who do we know? And how can we share this knowledge and act on it would be sort of my definition of social capital. And then again, also kind of using the kind of our positions. I mean, I say like the fact that Greg was a priest, that meant he was perceived in a particular way, he was trusted and seen as being selfless and so on. And that enabled him to do a lot of things which somebody who was maybe a business person or a local bank or whatever he wouldn't have had that kind of social capital. So people might have questioned that person's motivation. So that's a great example of how Greg used his particular social capital to achieve what he did, so his position in society.
Colin, in other parts of the world that you've studied, who are some living Greg MacLeods? Who are people we should be studying now?
Oh, I don't know. Often they kind of work under the radar, really. I suppose Greg was a little bit unusual that he didn't have this profile that both within the community and beyond the community. But I think because the sorts of things we're discussing are kind of local, they don't really have the profile. I mean, just thinking about the lady in West Kilbride who had the vision of transforming West Kilbride into Scotland's craft town to make use of all these empty shops. I mean, she's not known really beyond the confines of West Kilbride, but there'll be lots of people like her in lots of different communities. There's a town in southwest Scotland where the community bought the local harbour, for example. So, and often the kind of community, okay, you perhaps need a leader, but often it's actually very much community based. So one person may kind of take the lead, but they build kind of the community. And I'm sure if you kind of explored, you wouldn't have to kind of delve down too deeply to find folk like Greg MacLeod, maybe not quite as inspirational or not quite as extensive activities, but doing stuff to benefit the community in imaginative ways. And I think also it's important to develop your own solutions rather than kind of importing them from somewhere else. I mean, back to this idea of effectuation, you've got unique assets, so there's no point bringing in a solution from somewhere else that is matched to a different set of assets. So you do have to say, well, what are the assets that we can build upon? And I say, don't reinvent what other people have done. I'm thinking of a place in Scotland, quite a long time ago, developed itself as a book town, so there's a book festival every year, and that kind of brings in economic activity. There's only scope for so many book towns. There's another place in Scotland, I can't quite remember, but it was just focused for a major film, so they've used that asset to build economic activity. The people who are fans of the film kind of came to Michelle, can you remember what it's called? No. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, what's your assets and how can you exploit them? Again, my memory's going. There's an Eagles song which mentions a town in anyway, whatever it's called. Anyway, so that place kind of used that as an asset to people came because they wanted to see the town that the Eagles sang about. I'll come back to it 5 minutes after I leave you.
So thank you very much. I'd like to invite Father Bill Burke to come forward and give the official thank you. Bill is on the board of the Newman Society, an organization that Father Greg began and helps students. They also have their own home here in Sydney. It's actually Father Greg's home that he donated with Father Dan. So, Bill Burke.
When Harvey was introducing Colin, he said you had a direct connection, not only with Father Greg, but with Cape Breton and with the whole story. And as you continue to elaborate on that in the last hour, and especially with that notion of geographical inequality, that's one thing I've not heard before. And I'm one of those people who didn't know what a geographical economist was, but you were telling our story in detail. You were completely telling our story and Greg's role in it. And you know, when we look at our story, it wasn't just Greg. He was steeped in the tradition, as you said, of Moses Cody and Jimmy Tompkins, but also of Andy Hogan, Father Bill Roach, John Tapstick, George Topshe, and the lay people that they worked with and the religious. I still remember as a kid listening to the People's School on CJCB television. These men not just had dreams, Colin, they had vision. They truly did. And Greg was a giant in that tradition, truly a giant. And I'm also impressed with the comments that were after. I'm honestly not being political about this. But coming out here this evening, I was listening to the Scottish singer Amy MacDonald singing Flowers of Scotland. And the verse there that says, those days are past now, and in the past they must remain. But we can still rise now and be a nation again. And I believe that here in Cape Breton, we need people of vision, and they will come forth, but it's going to take hard work, that we will rise again and become vibrant communities. And your presentation this evening has been very hopeful, as well as informative, very hopeful. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite you to hang around if you'd like to speak with Dr. Mason or just have some tea and oatcakes. We'll be here for a while. There's also books for sale at the entrance. So there's 2 books available. They're $20. One is Father Dan's book on Dr. Greg MacLeod, and the other is Dr. Herbert Johnson's book on the economic principles and how to innovate. So please stick around, and if you'd also like to get an email for our next lecture in the 2nd semester, you can add your email list over here at the corner table, and we'll be sure to personally invite you to the next year's Greg MacLeod lecture. Thank you all for being here.